Hello, this video is about psychosis, and in particular, the goal is to discuss what it means to have a neurodiversity-affirming approach to psychosis. Part of the motivation for this video is just personal interest in the topic, and in particular, I've noticed that psychosis seems to be overlooked. It is, of course, a topic that's not discussed much in society at large. I think people often feel discomfort or unease when the topic of psychosis comes up. But perhaps more unfortunately yet is that even within the neurodiversity movement, and to some extent, resources related to mental health, psychosis still seems to be overlooked quite a bit. I think that there are a lot of parallels between psychosis and other forms of neurodivergence, but there's also some pretty key differences. And at least in my mind, the prominent difference that comes up is essentially one of positivity. So for other forms of neurodivergence, such as autism, they are often considered to be a key part of someone's identity. Autistic people are going to be autistic throughout our lives, even if we don't realize that we're autistic as a child, even if we receive our diagnosis later in life, or perhaps never receive it at all, we're still autistic. And so for many autistic people, it grows to be a very core and comfortable part of who we are. And while we might not necessarily love every single aspect of being autistic, and of course, as with any way of thinking or being or communicating, there's often going to be strengths and challenges. There can still often be an overall happiness with being autistic. And many autistic people would not want there to be a cure for autism, even if such a thing existed. Um, Psychosis is often a very different experience. Of course, both autism and psychosis are very, very varied experiences. Each person is going to have a different perspective, and there can be overlap. There can be autistic people who also experience psychosis. In fact, there's a disproportionate overlap. But to just kind of use a generalized example now, if you think about someone who develops psychosis later in life, that can be, in many cases, it can be a very stressful and even traumatic experience. It's often something that a person might feel is bringing them further away from themselves and further away from their relationships rather than being a key part of themselves. For example, someone might be on a certain path or trajectory in their life, and then they reach, say, their 20s or some other point, and they might start experiencing really distressing ideas, perhaps delusions. In some cases, it can really interfere with the person's ability to feel safe in their otherwise secure environments or in relationships and friendships that otherwise were very comforting and key points of connection for them. The first aspect that comes to mind is respect. I think that respect is really the fundamental building block of all human interactions. I don't think that it's possible to build a really healthy framework, let alone a neurodiversity affirming one, if we don't have that basic respect for another person. And the way that, at least one way that I think this might appear in practice is a willingness to learn from people with psychosis, and in particular, the community of people with psychosis overall. And more specifically, I want to point out a few areas that I think people with psychosis are likely to have especially valuable insight. One is that if you're someone who experiences or has experienced psychosis, you often probably had to think about your perception of reality in a greater level of detail than many people do. Many people will probably go through life, and understandably so, just assuming and taking for granted that what they're perceiving is connected to the reality that other people are also perceiving. If you experience the things, whether it's hallucinations, whether it's sort of delusions or other atypical beliefs that call that into question, you have to think about it a lot. Or at least many people in that situation will end up thinking a lot about reality testing and questioning, in a sense, the nature of reality in a way that can lead to some unique insight, unique perspective on what it means for something to be subjective versus objective, um, and what it means to sort of bridge differences in understanding. Um, I actually wonder sometimes if the community of people with psychosis could be a really valuable resource for bridging gaps between ideological differences or people with other differences of opinion, because there's this familiarity with what it means to have to maybe even firmly believe and experience one set of things while also being told and recognizing that those around you are not experiencing it at all. There have been research articles that find people with psychosis have slightly elevated scores on affective empathy, although those results are going to vary depending on which paper you're looking at. But one particularly interesting paper found that um, if they tested patients with psychosis and patients without psychosis and had them imagine different types of painful stimuli, both related to themselves and related to others, the patients with psychosis appeared to process what's called other related stimuli, which to my understanding is imagining other people experiencing pain in a way that's typically more closely reserved to people imagining pain within themselves. So patients with psychosis appeared to actually have, relatively speaking, a greater valuation and empathy for the pain of others, um, or at least a higher level of brain activation when imagining that kind of pain. Um, and this seemed certainly, I think, to be a very interesting result, and one that is anecdotally supported by people talking about how experiences, going through very difficult times of psychosis can result in a lot more empathy for the pain of other people. Um, and one other area that I think people with psychosis might have unique insight in is essentially this concept of being a canary in the coal mine. Um, this is something that has been discussed related to autism before. I believe that Autistic Doctors International has a canary, I think actually a canary wearing a stethoscope, if I remember correctly, as their symbol or mascot. And the reason is based on this idea that autistic patients might often benefit from accommodations that end up helping everyone. The autistic patients might kind of shed light on ways in which the healthcare system really could be better run for everyone. And so they're almost sort of like an indicator in that way. And of course, even if that weren't the case, it would still be worth doing the accommodations just to help the people who need them. Um, but the fact that it does have a more widespread impact, I think, is interesting as well. And I imagine that that applies for psychosis as well, perhaps in slightly different ways. One article that comes to mind that I believe was actually on the topic of post-traumatic growth discussed, um, as a small portion of it, it discussed psychosis and religion and spirituality. And while I'm not knowledgeable enough on this sort of combination of topics to discuss in great detail, it was interesting that people with psychosis had often experienced or had sometimes experienced after a first time psychotic episode, um, a increased sense of religion or spirituality, but often with sort of healthy guardrails in place. They had sort of developed ways to protect themselves from forms of religious practices that were likely to cause them distress or were likely to become very commanding or threatening or sort of entwined with symptoms of psychosis that led them to an unhealthy place. Um, and I imagine that people with more knowledge of religion and spirituality than me could probably benefit a lot from talking with people who've experienced religious based symptoms and psychosis. And I'm sure that there's many other areas of life as well that could perhaps benefit from their insight. The second aspect that comes to mind is essentially accessibility and quality of supports available. So if we just think about treatment for psychosis or support for psychosis, um, one part is identification. So are we actually able to identify and identify in sort of an equal and fair way when someone might be experiencing signs of psychosis and perhaps could benefit from additional support? And unfortunately, as with many things, the answer is not yet. Right now, for example, people with intellectual disabilities might not have signs of psychosis identified as quickly. The third area of a neurodiversity affirming approach, I think, is reducing stigma and reducing misconceptions. Almost every area of neurodivergence, if not all, unfortunately come with a certain amount of myths or misconceptions from the world at large. And psychosis, unfortunately, is not an exception to this. So, one of the first misconceptions that appears is the belief that people with psychosis are inherently dangerous or violent. Um, and this is, I think, a particularly difficult one because if someone believes this myth to be true, that's obviously going to cause them, or at least it's very likely to cause them to avoid people with psychosis entirely, um, which is going to create this cycle where it's probably going to be very hard for them to have enough interaction with someone with psychosis to realize that it's not necessarily true. Um, of course, they might be interacting with people who have experienced psychosis and they just don't know that's the case. Um, but that, I guess that's a slightly different situation and one that also wouldn't help them dispel this myth. So it is worth saying that this myth is not true as a blanket statement at all. The majority of people with schizophrenia, I realize that's only one form of something that could cause psychosis, but the majority of people with schizophrenia do not have violent behaviors. And some research has suggested that the percentage of people with schizophrenia who have exhibited violent behaviors is around 10 to 15%, which is a pretty small percentage overall. Um, and what is perhaps a more striking statistic is actually the reverse, that people with schizophrenia, especially if living in a community setting, are 14 times more likely to experience violence directed towards them. So they're much more likely to be a victim of violence rather than someone who is violent towards others. Um, and unfortunately, I think this can be just the vulnerability factor. People with psychosis often might experience challenges related to housing, employment, discrimination in a variety of different settings. And whenever someone's vulnerable, unfortunately, they might be more likely um, to be abused in a variety of different ways. I also sometimes wonder if the nature of reality testing that often occurs in people with psychosis, the fact that people with psychosis often have memories and experiences which can feel very real and are very real in the sense that they really happen within the person's mind, but to have that kind of called into question and told that that's not objectively the case, um, might make someone more prone to be a victim of gaslighting. I don't think that there's research specifically looking at this link. At least I haven't been able to find it, but I would conjecture that it's probably the case for at least some people. I remember reading in particular one very heartbreaking story, and I wasn't able to find it before making this video. I'd read it a while ago, but it was of someone who had an episode of psychosis, and was quite certain that someone close to them had abused them during that episode of psychosis. Um, but he was not able to tell for sure afterwards. The person insisted that it was just a hallucination. He felt like it was different than his other hallucinations, and he felt like it was characteristic of actually experiencing abuse, but he doesn't know for sure. And I guess as a reader, I also can't say with certainty one way or another, but I can imagine how stressful that situation would be. And yeah, I think it's very, I think it makes the misconception all the more sad. I did also want to comment though, because I think sometimes the sort of debunking of myths can leave it at this sort of disproportionality, noting that people with schizophrenia or psychosis certainly are not always dangerous or violent. What happens if someone actually isn't that 10 to 15%? What happens if someone does lash out physically or behave in a physically aggressive way when they're experiencing psychosis? Um, Obviously, that can be a really scary situation for everyone involved. I don't want to minimize that at all. I think the intentions are important, certainly, but they don't define the impact of something. So if someone has been physically injured, that is, of course, serious. But I think the word violent, it applies and it also doesn't fully capture, I think, what happens in those situations because um, it, for all intents and purposes, from the individual's perspective, in many cases, violence is really meant as self-defense. Whoever you are, if you genuinely believe that someone is going to hurt you, or if hurting yourself or others is necessary to somehow enact this broader benefit or good, as people might believe if they have, certain types of delusions or hallucinations, that kind of altered perception of events might lead one to respond in an altered way. And while it's obviously really tragic when that happens, I don't think it makes the person violent in the way that the word typically is used. And it's something that probably, in some cases, when people come out of a psychotic episode and realize what happened, they might feel an immense guilt for it. So that was a longer discussion on that, but hopefully helpful in some ways. Um, all right, misconception number 2. This one I think is a pretty short one. The misconception that psychosis is caused by recreationally using substances. This is not always the case. I think in particular, it can be not great when people try to look for sort of a cause of blame or a way to pinpoint psychosis on something they perceive the person did wrong at some point prior. There are people who have had no experience at all with substances of any kind and have developed psychosis. There are people without a family history of psychosis who've developed psychosis. There's not always a clear cause for it. And again, I would note that in the instances where substance use was a factor in an individual developing psychosis, the person is no less deserving of treatment, and the resulting psychosis is not going to be any easier or less important because of the way that it was caused. So this misconception, I think, is it's not only not true, but also not necessarily that relevant, perhaps. All right, so the third misconception, for lack of a better phrase, is the idea that psychosis is always the same, that people with psychosis, generally the belief is that people with psychosis always have schizophrenia and always have, usually the belief is that there's always going to be a complete break from reality where someone might hear voices, see things, and perhaps have certain paranoid delusions. Um, and that absolutely can be the case for a lot of people, and that can be very distressing a lot of times. But it's not the only way that psychosis can present, and it's not the only cause of psychosis. While schizophrenia certainly can be a cause of psychosis, so can bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, anxiety-induced psychosis. Certain medical conditions can also cause psychosis, and I believe that sometimes medication reactions can cause psychosis in rare instances as well. Um, But even the way that psychosis presents can be so variable. Firstly, the degree to which someone is aware that they're experiencing psychosis can vary a lot. There's not been, to my knowledge, enough information out there that someone can experience psychosis, can experience hallucinations and delusions while also being aware, either fully or partially, that it's not probably going to match the objective reality. Um, Again, I think the word reality is not ideal because it's real to the person experiencing it, but hopefully, yeah, hopefully you understand it in the way that I intended. Um, Likewise, maybe a good analogy for it is there's headsets currently, right? Virtual reality headsets being developed. And someone might put on a headset, for example, a person with a fear of heights, they might put on a virtual reality headset that simulates them falling from a height. And they know that they're standing on the ground, they know that they're not moving at all. But depending on how real and immersive the experience is, knowing that might not take away the anxiety they experience when they're in a simulation that is feeding information to their senses that they are falling. Um, Even if the fact that they know it isn't real helps reduce the panic somewhat, or maybe even greatly, they might still experience at least some of the thought processes they would if they were actually falling, and certainly might find it to be distracting if they were to also, um, be asked to navigate other things at the same time, like to carry on a conversation while going through that simulation. Um, Likewise, even if someone is fully aware that the hallucinations they're experiencing aren't real, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be distressing at all or impactful at all. Um, and now when we get into the symptoms themselves or the traits of psychosis itself, that too can be quite varied and can appear in ways that people often might not be aware of. For example, hearing voices is, I think, a fairly well-known symptom associated with psychosis. Seeing things is fairly well known. Um, but there can also be what I believe are called somatic hallucinations, and tactile hallucinations. For example, someone might feel as if they're being touched, or might feel a texture or even an internal sensation that is a hallucination. Um, Someone might smell an odor that isn't there, or food might appear, or appear probably isn't the right word. Food might seem to taste different in a way that's distressing. Um, there can also be a variety of different delusions. Sometimes there can be grandiose delusions. Sometimes there can be very fear-inducing delusions. Um, but really, I would imagine that delusions can take on quite a broad range of beliefs. Um, there's also erotomania, where someone might have delusions that center on what's often called love. I guess it would really be more of a sort of obsessive affection or lust. But that can actually be a delusion as well. Um, Psychosis can also come with strange feelings or beliefs, social withdrawal, um, depression, and difficulty forming thoughts or expressing thoughts in the way that the person typically would. And one question that I was really struggling with how to present when coming up with this video is, are all the symptoms distressing? I think I've been presenting them as if they are. Are there any symptoms that are enjoyable? Um, and I know that sometimes there can be moments of symptoms that can be less distressing or can be even relatively pleasant. I wasn't able to find a research article on the topic. I imagine it exists. I probably just wasn't putting the correct search words in. Um, but I did find this quote that seemed quite helpful, where the person essentially wrote that they don't necessarily find the experience of psychosis ever to be fully enjoyable. Um, but they did have one voice. This person hears, I think, a variety of voices, most of which were distressing, but one voice was kind and compassionate. And they'd even named the voice, um, and found that voice to sort of be a relief and a source of comfort as well. Um, One other thing that I think supports this potential perspective is that in an article on why people might delay seeking help for psychosis, especially those who've had it from a young age, have had certain hallucinations. Um, in some cases, people felt like it had just become normal for them, it become part of their life, and it wasn't necessarily as um, anxiety inducing. Um, and I will link that research article there below as well, because again, that's kind of a nuanced topic, and the article goes into it quite well. The final aspect of neurodivergence, or I guess the neurodiversity affirming approach, I think is going to be accommodations. So that was discussed a little bit earlier in terms of support for the psychosis directly. But what about if someone just wants to go to work or go for a social outing? What accommodations might be put in place to help someone with psychosis feel more comfortable? Um, and the list that I could think of or could find are fairly straightforward and perhaps common sense, like a flexible schedule. You know, if someone is going through unpredictable experiences related to psychosis, or is going through a difficult time with really any kind of mental health condition, flexibility can be helpful. Um, I know sometimes this can be a challenging balancing act because other people might really thrive with structure and predictability, or might become anxious with changes in schedule. But there might be a way to, to sort of figure out a setup that works for everyone's flexibility needs. Um, and certainly from an employment perspective, making sure that mental health is taken seriously as a reason to take a day off or to have leave, just as hopefully physical illness would be treated. Rest area or private space can be helpful if someone's at work. Perhaps a support animal or a support person in certain settings can be helpful. Making sure that above all that you're willing to discuss with the person and figure out if there's something that would be helpful for them in particular. Maybe there's a really specific trigger for their psychosis that could easily be avoided if it's just discussed ahead of time. There might be times where someone could behave a bit more um, argumentatively than they typically would, or might make statements that they otherwise wouldn't. For example, maybe believing that someone's going to hurt them, or becoming afraid of someone that they typically have a good relationship with. And if there can be more understanding of where that type of behavior is coming from, and the fact that it's generally not a reflection of who the person really is and what they believe and how they want to relate, um, I think that that would overall probably result in a more accessible world. Um, so that's about all that I have to say. And I think that was quite a lot, but thank you very much for listening to this. Um, this is obviously a topic that I'm still learning a lot about myself, and any comments, suggestions, feedback would be absolutely welcome. So thank you and take care.